Into the Inklands is finally here, and with it comes two awesome new starter decks. Today, we're going to take a look at the Sapphire Ruby deck, Plenty of Pluck.
How does it work? How does it play? What should you keep in your hand? We're going to take a quack at answering those questions and more.
Plenty of Pluck is probably the more challenging of the two new starter decks in Into the Inklands, but it doesn't mean that you should shy away from it. With a ton of new fun mechanics and new cards, it's a blast to play, and it can be a really great deck when it all comes together. Oh, and it's also super themey, centered on two awesome franchises, Moana and DuckTales.
DuckTales, woo! Like the Dogged Dynamic starter deck, this deck is designed to introduce you to a bunch of new cards, with 27 different cards total and plenty of 1-ofs and 2-ofs, so it's not the most consistent deck, meaning you'll have to adapt depending on what you draw. So let's take a look at the cards in this deck, starting with your 1-cost characters.
Now, you don't have a ton of options here. There are really only two. Minnie Mouse, always classy, and Flounder, voice of reason. Both of these are vanilla cards, meaning they don't have any abilities. Minnie Mouse is a 1/3, making her the more durable of the two, but at 1 strength, it's harder to banish other characters with her.
Flounder packs a slightly bigger punch as a 2/2. Now, which one of these is the better play largely depends on who you're playing, but what I will offer is this. If you're playing against the other Inklands starter deck, Dogged and Dynamic, Flounder is usually always the better play, because your opponent has Pluto as an 0/2 that they can play to ramp on turn 2. So if you have Flounder in play, you can remove Pluto in a challenge. With Minnie, you can't.
On turn 2, your options are really going to open up with 8 different characters. Up first is Della Duck. She's a 3/3 with Reckless. Now, Reckless just means that she has to challenge if she's able to every turn and she can't quest. And with a 3/3 stat line, she packs a really big punch for turn 2, so she's a great card.
Next up is Hey Hey Accidental Explorer, a really interesting card. With 2 lore on turn 3, he goes down kind of easy, but he has an interesting ability, allowing you to reduce your opponent's lore every time he moves to a location. Now, because moving to locations requires 1 lore, you probably won't be able to make too much use of him early game, but in the mid to late game, he can really come in handy. And I also find his art super interesting. I do feel like Hey Hey is being the butt of a joke here.
Simba Scrappy Cub is a really aggressive play in this deck. He's a 1/1, but he has 3 lore, which on turn 2 is just great. Now, there are no bodyguards in this deck, so don't expect him to stick around long. Once he quests, he'll probably be challenged.
Another semi-aggressive play are your 2 copies of Duke Weaselton, with 2 lore on turn 2. Now, he's a 1/2, meaning he's a bit more survivable than Simba, but still expect him to go down pretty quickly if you quest with him early.
Cogsworth Talking Clock is also a really interesting play. With 3 willpower on turn 2, it's not too shabby. He also has a really interesting ability. He allows you to exert a reckless character and have them gain a lore. And remember Della Duck from earlier? She is 3 of your 6 reckless cards in this deck.
Next up is Huey, the first of the nephews in the nephew combo that we'll talk about in detail later. But in the absence of the combo, he has support, which gives him a little extra utility. If you quest with him on turn 3, he can give your turn 1 Flounder or Minnie a little extra punch when challenging an opponent's character.
And now for Scrooge McDuck himself. He's a 1/3 with 1 lore, which isn't a great stat line for turn 2, but he does have a cool ability. Whenever he quests, he reduces the cost of items by 1, increasing your ramp.
Oh, do we mention this deck has items? Because it has items. Not terribly many, only 5 in total, and we'll talk about them all in a little bit, but that means Scrooge McDuck can give you some decent value early because all of the items are pretty good. Unfortunately though, since there are so few items, you'll probably get to use Scrooge once, maybe twice, but yeah, good in the early game.
Now your final turn 2 option is actually a location. Montanui to be specific. This is kind of a fun play. Whenever a character is banished there, you get to put it in your inkwell.
Pure Grandma Tala vibes.
Now, this is a fine turn 2 play, but we actually recommend maybe saving it for turn 3, especially if you have another character you can play on turn 2. If you do save it for turn 3, you can pay 2 to play Montanui and then use your 3rd ink to move a character there, increasing the likelihood that you'll get a payoff from this ability.
This is a great time to have a ramp conversation. In Lorcana, because cards in your inkwell generally come from your hand, every time you manage to put a card there from somewhere else, you're saving your hand. You're saving resources. It's card advantage without the card draw. And this deck could definitely benefit from some card advantage as there's only 5.5 cards that draw in this deck.
Wait, 5.5 cards?
Yeah, counting Huey as half a card. He only works if you set up the nephew combo, which is difficult to do, so 5.5.
Sure. There are also 8 options at 3 ink. Let's get started with the second location in this deck, Agrabah. Agrabah is a 1/5 and gains you 2 lore at the start of each of your turns. As a reminder, locations give you lore at the start of each of your turns. You don't have to quest.
Next up is the uninkable Kakamora, with 3 copies in this deck. Now, he's a 3/2 on turn 3, so not the best stat line, but he has an interesting ability, and that is, he causes each opponent to lose 1 lore when he comes into the game. So not necessarily a great play on turn 3, but later in the game he can move your opponent 1 step further from victory. And in multiplayer, he's fun as well.
Maui's the second uninkable card at 3 ink, and he's a little goofy. He's a 5/2 with Reckless, and he has a super fun ability. When you actually quest with Hey, Maui loses Reckless and gains a lore. This makes him a little bit more versatile than your standard Reckless card.
Webby's your standard vanilla 3/4 with 1 lore for 3 ink. She's fine. She's got 4 willpower. I don't know. She's decent. Next up, it's the next nephew in the nephew combo with Dewey, Showy Nephew. He's a 2/3 for 3 ink, so his stats are fine. Not great, but he does have support, which makes him a little useful.
The last character at 3 ink is Gyro Gearloose, and he's fine. He's a 1/4 with 1 lore, but he does try to make up for it with a kind of neat ability. He allows you to take an item from your discard pile and put it on the top of your deck.
Now, here's the thing. This is good, not great. It's not great because you only have 5 items in your deck, and so the scenarios where you have an item in your discard pile that you need to put on the top of your deck, like a talisman, for example, won't arise too often. When it does, it's a really good payoff. By the way, have we talked about the talisman yet?
I don't think so.
On to the items.
First up is a Sumerian Talisman. This card says that during your turn, when one of your characters is banished during a challenge, you can draw a card. This is super helpful in a deck that has really limited card draw, and it makes controlling the board and deciding to challenge your opponent's characters a little bit more palatable.
Next up, you have Maui's Fishhook, and this card has a few different abilities, and I'm just going to read from the screen here. What it allows you to do is pay 2 ink and exert this item to do one of 2 things. First, you can give a chosen character evasive until the start of your next turn, making them difficult to challenge, or second, you can give a character 3 strength. Now, this item is fine in the early and the mid game, but not great because it requires 2 ink, and using it will force you to sacrifice developing your board and playing other cards. Unless you have a Maui in play, in which case using its shapeshifter ability is free. But in the late game, when you have more resources available and are trying to close things out, it can actually be really good because it can give some of your high lore characters, like Simba for example, evasive, making them difficult to remove and allowing you to close out the game.
For the last item, we have to move to 4 ink, the Vault Door. This card gives all of your locations and characters at locations resist 1. And since we've already established that your locations are so good in this deck, you definitely want them to stick around, and giving them resist 1 helps them do that.
Yeah.
So use it if you have it.
And I actually think Agrabah with resist 1 can be a closer in this deck. We'll talk about that later, but it's pretty good. For our other turn 4 options, we have to move to characters, and the first one up is Moana, a 3/4 with evasive. And evasive is just a good ability, we've already established that, but there's something else I want you to remember. If you're playing in a tournament against the Dogged and Dynamic starter deck, there are a couple characters with evasive that are game changers. The first one is Don Carnage, who's a 4/4 who quests for 2 lore, and you want to get him off the board if you can. The second one is Wildcat, a 2/3 with evasive who can banish your items. And you like your items in this deck, so keep an eye out for him.
Next up is another character with evasive, but only on your turn. Flintheart Glomgald is a 3/4 with 2 lore.
Next up is Grandma Tala, Keeper of Ancient Stories. Now, this is one of the few cards that gives you card draw in this deck. When she comes into play, you can look at the top 2 cards of your deck, put one in your hand, and put the other on the bottom of your library. Now, in a deck that relies on combos and synergies, this is super helpful because you can look through your cards and find the card that you need. Unfortunately, you're left with a 3/3 with 1 lore on the board, but the card draw is super good.
Last up at 4 ink is the third nephew, Louis. He's a 3/4 with support, and he's got 2 lore.
On to 5 ink. At 5 ink, Maid Marian is a 4/4 with 2 lore, and when she enters play, she gives -2 strength to an opposing character. Now, don't overlook this card because she can really swing board states. Oftentimes, your opponent exerts characters expecting trades if they're challenged, and Maid Marian changes this math a bit. So Maid Marian gets you a 2 lore character on the board and allows you to remove an opponent's character, potentially not having to trade, which is pretty good.
Next up is a single copy of Scrooge McDuck, Richest Duck in the World. He's a 3/5 with 1 lore, and he gains evasive on your turn. And when he challenges and banishes an opposing character, you actually get to play an item for free. So that's kind of cool.
Yeah. For your last character, you have Moana, who's a 4/4 with 2 lore, and she has a kind of a neat ability. When she quests at a location, you can ready all of the characters at that location, but they can't quest for the rest of the turn. Now, there's something I want to talk about here, because this Moana is Floodborn, meaning you can shift her into play. Now, oftentimes we think of shift as a way to get expensive characters into play cheaper, but there's a big cost that you have to consider, and that is you lose one of your characters on the board. And the Moana that you're shifting onto in this deck is pretty good. So if you're using the shift to get Moana into play cheaper, consider what you're giving up, and that is a pretty good 3/4 Moana with evasive. The way you really want to use this shift ability is to shift Moana onto a character whose ink is already dried, allowing you to quest with her on the turn that she's played.
Before we talk strategy, we need to talk about the actions. There are 2 actions in this deck with 2 copies each. The first is Dragon's Fire from the first chapter. This 5-cost uninkable card allows you to banish another character.
The second action in this deck is kind of an interesting one. It's Voyage, a single ink action that allows you to move 2 characters to a single location for free. Now, one thing to remember is that in this deck, each location only requires 1 ink to move a character there. So at best, this card is only saving you 1 ink at the cost of 1 card from your hand. And so most of the game, this card isn't terribly great, but when it pays off, it can really pay off, allowing you to achieve some super cool moves. For example, moving 2 characters at once to Motunui to make use of that location's ability. Or perhaps you have a Vault Door and Agrabah in play and you can get 2 characters there really quickly to allow you to make use of the resist. When it pays off, it's really great, but it doesn't always pay off. And that's it. This deck caps out at 5-cost cards, with a vast preponderance of them being cost 3 or below.
Now let's talk about synergies. This deck is full of them. Heihei in Maui, Scrooge in items, Heihei in locations, the nephew, Cogsworth, and Reckless characters.
Synergies are an important part of this deck's script and its game plan. It's what makes this deck win. First up, let's talk about the nephews, which is the most obvious of the synergies and combos. Now, when you get all 3 nephews in play, questing with Huey allows you to draw 3 cards, which is just fantastic. When you're playing with a starter deck, drawing 3 cards in a turn can actually win you games. But here's the thing about this combo. It's difficult to achieve because there's only 1 copy of Huey in this deck. If your Huey is banished, you cannot achieve it. And so you should play to it if you can, but it's not one that you should rely on because, again, that 1 Huey could be at the bottom of your deck. So be careful about relying on this one too much.
Now, there are tons of other synergies we could talk about here, and we've talked about a lot of them earlier in this video, but the one other one that we want to bring up again is Cogsworth and Reckless characters. Cogsworth is really valuable in this deck and can really win games. When you get into that late game play, drawing Reckless characters can really hurt because you're unable to quest with them, but having Cogsworth on the board can really rectify that. So be strategic about when you use him. If you get him out early in the game, don't risk him needlessly.
So overall, what does this deck want you to do? Well, first, it wants you to play it at synergies and combos like we mentioned before. The other thing it kind of wants you to do is board control. It wants you to keep control of the board with efficient trades throughout the early and the mid game in order to set yourself up for the later game. In the late game, you can use your 2 lore characters like Maid Marian or Moana, or maybe a location like Agrabah to close things out. And when I say efficient trades, what do I mean? I mean that you're using your synergies and your combos to maximize the value of every single card and using support when you can. Keep in mind this deck has 6 characters with support. Use all of this to your advantage. Again, the one tricky thing here though is these synergies are hard to play to because this deck has 27 different cards, and so each draw is going to be very different. So you have to be really smart and really clever about identifying the combos and synergies you can achieve each and every game. So identify the combos that you can leverage and draw to the ones you need to. There's no one combo or synergy that you can rely on each and every game. There's also one card that I want to mention late game, and that's Agrabah. If you've managed to control the board and your opponent doesn't have very many resources available, Agrabah can really close out games, especially if you have Vault Door in play, making it very difficult to remove. Do consider Agrabah as a closer if you've managed to keep board control throughout the game.
And really, we have to say, don't be afraid to fall behind in a lore rush. This deck is not meant to be aggro, although there is an aggro line of play. It is really meant to control the game state. And you do also have 2 cards that reduce your opponent's lore, so if you do fall a little bit behind later in the game, you can knock your opponent down a peg or 2.
Let's take a look at the first 3 turns and 3 lines of play. And the first up is the aggro play. Now, as we said, this deck isn't really designed to be that aggressive, but you can be if you want to and you get the right draw. But it works best on the play. On turn 1, you play Minnie Mouse. On turn 2, it's either Simba or Duke Weaselton with 3 or 2 lore respectively. On turn 3, you're playing Agrabah. At this point on turn 3, you're questing for 3 or 4 lore, with Agrabah threatening 2 lore on turn 4. At this point, your opponent has to make a choice between removing your location or challenging your characters. At the start of turn 4, you have 6 to 8 lore and are applying pressure.
Now for the control play. On turn 1, you really want to be able to play a character. You have both Flounder or Minnie Mouse, but there are only 5 cards in the deck for turn 1. Turn 2, try to get Della Duck out. She's a 3/3, and on turn 2, that's just good. Turn 3, you can play Webby, Maui, or Dewey. If you quest with Dewey on turn 4, you'll be able to give +2 strength to your turn 1 character. This will allow you to trade a 1-cost character for a more expensive character. And then ideally, you want to play the Sumerian Talisman on turn 4.
For the next line of play, it's your ramp play. Now, this line really relies on you getting Motunui in play on turn 3. What you want to do is get Flounder on turn 1, then you want to play Duke Weaselton or Simba on turn 2. These are your high lore questers. On turn 3, you play Motunui for 2, and then you move your turn 2 play there. What this does is set up a situation where your high lore quester is on Motunui, and you force your opponent into a decision. Do they challenge and remove your high lore quester, or do they focus on your location? Either you're going to get a lot of lore, or you're going to ramp. The reason Flounder is a great play on turn 1 here is because he has less willpower than Minnie, which is kind of counterintuitive. He's easier for your opponent to remove once you get him on Motunui, and he's also easier for you to remove in a challenge. The whole point of this play is to force your opponent into a difficult decision, and to possibly get yourself ink into your inkwell from the board rather than your hand.
Finally, let's talk your mulligan, and we'll start with your uninkable cards. There are 13 in this deck, so you could really run into a problem early in the game if you have some unlucky draws. Be careful not to keep too many in your opening hand. Honestly, we're only keeping 2 max.
For our next tip, I want to credit Eric Switzer from The Gamer, who wrote a fantastic article on this deck and spent a lot of time playtesting it. Normally when you look at your opening hand, you're focusing on your ink curve, making sure that you have a card to play each and every turn. But this deck is built on synergies and combos, and you might want to focus on those synergies and combos just as much, if not more, than your ink curve. Don't break up key combos like Hey Hey and Maui, or Maui and Maui's Fishhook. Or maybe you have Scrooge in your opening hand with a talisman that you can get out for cheaper. Perhaps you have Huey, the key duck in the duck combo, and another duck, and you want to draw for that third duck. Make sure you keep cards that work together. Also, with your curve, it is perfectly okay not to have a turn 1 play, but you will want to have a turn 2 if possible.
Now let's talk cards we're always keeping in our opening hands. Keep Sumerian Talisman, and we also really like Della Duck, as long as your ink to uninkable ratio can support her being in there. Finally, we're also keeping Motunui for the location synergy cards that are in the deck. And it also forces your opponent to make difficult decisions if you're able to move a character to that location on turn 3.
Whew, that was a lot. Did you get all that? What do you think of the Plenty of Pluck starter deck?
Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe.
And if you missed our video on the Dogged and Dynamic starter deck, you can check it out right here.